You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and I'm Chevy Lynn Vasky with the K-State Radio Network. Today's show starts with Kansas State University plant pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre and agronomist Romulo Lollato as they talk about the updated Kansas Wheat Variety Guide. Continuing the show is K-State canola breeder Mike Stamm, who discusses considerations growers should take for the upcoming planting season. K-State Horticulture Extension Specialist Cynthia Domenghini rounds out the show discussing planting a fall vegetable garden, dividing irises and peonies, and deadheading flowers. That and more is coming up ahead on this episode of Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we begin our show with Kansas State plant pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre and Romulo Lollato, agronomist with Kansas State University, as they discuss the Kansas Wheat Variety Guide. Thank you both for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Chevy. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And Romulo, it's the time of year that growers are selecting their wheat varieties. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Absolutely. It's one of the most important decisions the growers will take in the growing season, right? Because it not only will define what yield potential each one of those pieces of land can have on the long run, but also will define other management practices that will go into that piece of land, right? So at this moment in time, growers have so many varieties out there. I guess we're putting a list together. There's almost 100 varieties that growers can buy certified seed off. That's a lot of options for growers to try to navigate. And so during this time of the year, since this is a decision that will dictate a lot of what they will have to do in each one of those fields, as well as the potential of that field and what problems they may face in each one of those fields, right? It is definitely a very important decision that they make, and they need to make it right now to make sure that they still have available time to select a variety and find seed for it, get a good seed source, and plant that variety out. So absolutely a very important decision that growers need to consider many things when they are making that one decision.
Kelsey, the updated Kansas Wheat Variety Guide just came out. Can you give me a brief overview of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this document is something we put together and update every year, right? So you can find it. It's called Kansas Wheat Variety Guide. You can find it in the K-State bookstore, or you can find it at your local extension office. Sometimes we'll call it the MF991. And this is a document, again, we update it every year, and it has disease and insect ratings along with agronomic information for all of the important varieties here in Kansas. So we have some older varieties, but we work pretty hard to update ratings and also add new varieties as they're released into the market. So when you get this document, there's a number of things here. It's actually kind of a long document because we try to pack it full of information. So you'll come in, you'll find a little bit of information on how to select a variety, some recommendations we make for prioritizing different diseases in different parts of the state. And then you'll come into what we call the variety profile. So here you'll have all of the disease and agronomic information for some of the more popular or newer varieties in the region. And you'll also see some commentary from Romulo and myself and our colleagues that put this document together. It'll be similar to what you hear us say at a wheat plot tour, for example, right? Some strengths, some weaknesses, and overall commentary. I think one thing, too, that I'll point out is that if you go to the end of the document, so this is a long document, but if you go to the end, there's actually a table that lists all of the varieties and compares their variety disease ratings. So we have, for example, ratings for wheat streak mosaic complex and stripe rust and fusarium head blight or head scab, all lined up together there. So you can compare your varieties side by side. That's in Appendix 1 of the document. We also have the same for agronomic ratings. So for each of the varieties, we have their maturity, their height, their drought tolerance, and their straw strength all rated there side by side so you can take a look at your favorites. One thing I always like to point out is on the last page of the document, that's where we put the Clearfield and Coaxium. So those are our herbicide-traded technology varieties. And so they're kind of on a separate page. They've got their own page on the last page of the document, and there you can find your most popular coaxium and Clearfield or 2-gene Clearfield varieties.
And one comment I might have, right, just to clarify about these particular publications, that we will not necessarily cover yield record on this publication. There might be a comment or two on those different panels, right, but that's, of course, a very important trait that growers need to look for, whether that variety has a good yield record or not in their region, which is not covered here. But what we do cover in this publication is once growers have selected a set of varieties that have good yield record in their region, now they can start filtering these varieties out based on those traits of interest, right? So, for example, a grower is going to plant wheat after corn. Well, then perhaps headscap tolerance is going to be a priority number one right after that yield record, right? And so they can go and filter out those varieties based on that trait. Or perhaps the grower is not willing to put out a further fungicide. And so probably the grower should look for varieties that have a good yield record without fungicide in the region and good ratings for stripe rust and leaf rust, for example. So again, in this publication, we will summarize many of those traits of the varieties. The way we are coming up with those summaries are actually through a lot of observations. So back in May and June, Kelsey, myself, Eric DeWolf, and Jeff Whitworth, the other two authors of this publication, are going out in perhaps dozens or even 100-plus wheat fields out there and many demonstration plots and variety trials. And we're taking opportunistic ratings, right? So if a given trial has stripe rust, we'll take notes on how those varieties are handling that disease. If there's a drought, we'll take notes on drought tolerance of those varieties, or at least visual symptoms, right? So again, these are opportunistic readings that we take across, and we might end up with hundreds of observations over the years for a given variety, which is all summarized in this one pub in the end of the season. And that's why it's important to keep up with the newest version of this publication, because those ratings, they will change, or they might change over time depending on our latest observations of that variety.
You mentioned that this is an annual publication. Are there any major changes this year?
Yeah, that's a great thing. So like Romulo mentioned, we do update ratings, so always double check the variety that you're using this year, double check those ratings because, sometimes those ratings do change. For example, we know that sometimes we get new stripe rust races, right? So a variety like SY Monument, right, that was once more resistant to stripe rust, now has a slightly more susceptible rating, right? And that's something we track over time. This year we added actually 10 new varieties to the table. So as everybody knows, right, like Romulo mentioned, there are lots of varieties available to our producers. So if you go to the back of the document, you'll see we have ratings now for AG Golden, AG Radical, Golden Hawk, High Country, LCS Radar, WB 4347, KS Homesteader, CL Plus, AP24AX, LCS Warbird AX, and LCS Galloway, right? So that's actually a pretty long list of new varieties. And to add them, we pulled out some of the, older varieties, maybe pre-2015 varieties that we wouldn't have seed for anyway. The other piece I'll just point out is that we've been working to update our wheat streak complex ratings. This has been a pretty big issue in Kansas this year. So we've been, focused pretty hard on our wheat streak ratings. As a reminder, we've updated these. So really take a look at those wheat streak ratings because now, the best a variety has is really a 5, right? So that's kind of an intermediate reaction. And really, that represents what we see in the field, right? We just don't have any perfect bulletproof varieties. So again, go in there, check your favorite varieties or varieties you're considering purchasing this year, right? And just double check those disease ratings and those agronomic ratings because they are adjusted annually. And I know Romulo and I are working pretty hard to summarize that data between harvest and now.
And one question that we usually get from growers, right, sometimes they don't find their favorite variety there or they don't find a new variety there, right? And the reason that can be the case, especially on the case of a new variety, is, again, we're taking opportunistic ratings. So we don't want to put out any information until we have seen that at least a few times so we can actually have more certainty on our own observations, right? So if a variety is just new this year and we just have 1 year of observations, we may have seen it 5-6 times, right? And on those 5-6 times, maybe we don't have enough data yet to put out for that new variety. But then perhaps next year we see it another 10 times, and then we say, okay, well, we're getting to a number of observations where we're confident with our own ratings here, and we can put it out with more confidence. So sometimes growers are not going to find the newest varieties out there, but we put them as soon as we have enough data to be confident on them.
Is there anything else you guys would like for growers to know coming from this guide or just in general as they're looking at choosing their varieties?
Again, review yield record. I think that, that will be number one in your own region. And then from there, use this variety guide to really help you make those decisions based on what you're willing or not to do in the guide, based on the risks of that. Each particular field as well are going to be exposed to, for example, Kelsey just mentioned with streak mosaic. That was a huge problem last year, and we're traveling around a little bit. Seems like there's still quite a bit of volunteer out there as well. I think that the dynamics of the rains have been a little bit challenging for growers to control, so that's another thing. If you know you're going to plant a field in a riskier situation, as Kelsey mentioned, no bulletproof variety out there, but things that can look like $1 million. So make sure that you're considering that in your decision. But don't consider only that. Look at your history as well, right? Central Kansas, if you make the decision only based on that one trait with streak mosaic virus, you might actually forget some important traits like stripe rust resistance or head scab or other things that are important as well. So again, make sure that you're considering many different aspects of what that field is going to be exposed to in that variety selection. And remember to spread out your risk via different maturities or different disease profiles as well in that farming operation.
Kelsey, Romulo, thank you both for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Chevy.
Again, that was Kansas State University's plant pathologist, Kelsey Andersen Onofre, and K-State agronomist, Romulo Lollato. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll have more for you up ahead. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue Thursday's show discussing canola and what producers should consider as we enter the growing season with K-State canola breeder Mike Stamm. Mike, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Glad to be here.
And Mike, it's the time of the year that producers are thinking about planting canola. How do planting dates vary across the state?
So when I think about planting canola in Kansas, I'm going to break the state into thirds. So in the northern part of the state, we need to think about an earlier planting date than we do in the south. So I typically tell producers in the northern third of the state to think about planting starting about September 1 through September 15. And then if you move into the central third of the state, it's your optimum is more like September 10th to September 20th. And then in the southern part of the state, it's September 20th to September 30th for that optimal window. But really, we have the whole month of September to work with for planting the crop. So, it's looking like soil moisture conditions are going to be pretty good across the state this year. So what I oftentimes tell growers is that if the soil moisture is there and they feel comfortable getting the crop in, to go ahead and plant it.
What about till versus no-till?
So we can grow canola both in a tillage and in a no-tillage system, but there are some differences that we need to think about. Canola is an interesting crop in that it doesn't like residue in the seed row, and so K-State has done a number of research studies on this over the years, and the primary thing to keep in mind is that if you're in a no-tillage system, we need to move that residue out of the seed row. So what we mean by that is you can plant canola on 30-inch rows and use a planter that has residue managers ahead of the seed row or ahead of the seeding disc, and so you can get that residue out of the way. Or you could use a more aggressive opener, like a wavy coulter on a drill, to move that residue out of the way. But the key thing is we have to move that residue out of the seed row because it can impact how the crop will overwinter if we don't do that.
What else is important for growers to keep in mind at this time of the year?
Well, planting date, of course, is probably the most important. And then, whether or not you're going to plant it in a tillage or no tillage system. We also need to think a little bit about seeding rates and what those are. And so over the years and the research that we've done, we've noted that canola can respond to a lower seeding rate than what we typically recommended in the past. Initially, we said, run a blanket 5 pounds to the acre, depending on, variety or what system you were using. But now we say, let's drop that back in that maybe 3 to 4 pounds per acre seeding rate. We do know that canola can compensate for a thin stand. Actually, your chances of winter survival are a little bit better if you drop that seeding rate because it just allows that plant to build some robustness to it and will enable those plants to overwinter. And so we really don't see a big yield difference if we go over 4 pounds to the acre. It really actually kind of starts to decline. That sweet spot is really kind of in that 3 to 4 pounds per acre seeding rate.
And as producers are thinking about planting season coming up, what about variety selection should they consider?
Well, there's lots of things to consider with variety selection with winter canola. And probably the first question I ask growers when they talk to me about what varieties I would recommend, I would ask them whether they're interested in growing an open pollinated variety or a hybrid variety. Your seed costs are going to differ. Typically with those two types, your hybrids are generally a little higher seed costs than what the OPs are. But the hybrids tend to give a little bit higher yield potential, and then also generally their oil contents are 1 to 3 percentage points higher than open pollinated varieties. So we're starting to see more hybrids kind of creep into Kansas and Oklahoma as our variety technologies have changed, and that's a good thing because the primary canola growing regions around the world are all growing hybrids now, and I think, in the near future, will be primarily a hybrid growing region. But that's not to say that there aren't good open pollinated varieties out there as well. One of the advantages of the open pollinated varieties is that you can purchase glyphosate resistant varieties, and so that gives you a broad spectrum of weed control, both broadleaves and grasses. And farmers really like that because they like the ease of weed control. On the hybrid side of things, there are currently no glyphosate-tolerant varieties, but you can use grass herbicides in the hybrids to control those troublesome grassy weed species that plague our wheat systems. And so both types are really good at helping you to manage the grassy weed species in our wheat systems, but it just really kind of comes down to personal preference, whether you would want to grow an open pollinated variety or a hybrid variety. We also tend to see a little bit better winter survival in the open pollinated varieties. That's primarily because the majority of those varieties have been released out of our breeding program at K-State, so they are very well adapted to our environmental conditions. And so I'll tell growers that, if winter survival is their biggest concern with canola, they should maybe think about growing an OP that was released from our breeding program, because we do have several options out there, and we have multiple licensees of our varieties, so they're pretty easy to get your hands on. So definitely some things to consider, whether it's wanting to push the yield envelope or you want to really hedge your bets against the possibility for winter kill. Those are all questions that I'm happy to help growers answer.
And Mike, can you talk just a little bit about site selection?
Yes, when we think about where we're going to plant canola, you want to consider, of course, what crop you're going to follow. And typically, of course, most canola growers are following winter wheat because that's really the easiest crop to follow because that land is available for canola planting. Some farmers have started planting canola after corn, and that presents a few more questions that we need to answer before we can do that. And probably the biggest question of concern with following corn is, what were the herbicides that you used in corn production that season? Because we know there are some pretty lengthy plant back restrictions for the common herbicides that we use in corn these days. And so it takes a little bit more planning to follow corn than it does winter wheat. So farmers need to plan ahead if they're wanting to do that in the future with this crop. So that's definitely a key question that I ask growers when they come to me and say, I want to plant canola. One of those first questions I ask, well, what crop are you following?
And I know we talked a little bit about weather earlier, but as this is a bit more of a moist year for Kansas, what things are producers seeing and how could this potentially help yield?
Well, I think it's going to be a good year for planting canola based on the rainfall patterns that we've seen across the state. Getting rainfall this time of year is definitely a benefit for canola because we know that soil moisture is absolutely critical for getting first to good stand, but then getting the crop up and growing so that it can attain enough top growth to get through our winter conditions. So it's exciting to me that this could be one of those years where it's a pretty easy decision to plant canola. We can also have the other extreme where it's almost too dry to plant it. We know that canola is not a crop that we really like to dust in because that planting date, of course, is so critical for getting it up and growing and allowing it to overwinter. So I'm pretty excited about where we are for this year, and we have good subsoil, which could lend itself, through the winter months as the crop is moving towards springtime.
Is there anything else that producers should keep in mind as we go into this growing season? Maybe something that they tend to forget or just overlook? I
think they should continue to keep their eye on the canola market. Right now, it's actually fairly strong for canola. And that's something, again, that's a positive. There are marketing options now for the crop in Kansas, and there's an ability to forward contract some production to allow producers to lock in some prices now. So I would definitely encourage them to watch the local market and see where this crop is going, because demand is very strong for canola oil, and that has a lot to do with the renewable fuels demand right now. So I think that's another positive for considering canola this year.
And you have some resources out right now about canola. Can you tell us where producers can find those?
Yeah, we recently wrote a few articles in the Agronomy e-update talking a lot about, we talked about today in terms of planting management, and we cover planting dates and seeding rates and site selection and variety selection. And so I would certainly turn to that information because it's the most up-to-date. And then certainly our Great Plains Canola Production Handbook is available through K-State Research and Extension, and that's got a much more in-depth information on canola production.
Mike, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Again, that was Kansas State University canola breeder Mike Stamm with what's currently happening in the canola industry and what growers should consider as we are entering planting season. I will be sure to link the resources that Mike mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. If you're interested in learning more about his e-updates, you can find them at eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll have more for you up ahead on Agriculture Today.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Chevy Lynn Vasky, I'm Jeff Wickman. If you've still got enough energy left following the spring and summer growing seasons, it's time to plant cool season vegetables that thrive in cooler weather, including leafy greens like lettuce, spinach, and kale, and root crops such as carrots, radishes, and beets. In addition, K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist Cynthia Domenghini says it's time to decide whether our iris and peony should be divided and if we want to deadhead flowers to promote blooming. Cynthia, still some things that we can do in the lawn and in the garden, and in particular, we can still plant some things in the garden.
Absolutely. Now, it may not feel like it, but fall is approaching, and we are getting to the time of planting that fall salad garden. So from mid-August through early September, you can think about seeding some of those leafy greens, even radishes and carrots for a fall garden. If you're going to be planting those in the ground, though, rather than in containers, you will want to plant the seeds a little bit deeper than you do in the spring, because then they'll be able to take advantage of that cooler soil temperature, and the water tends to be retained a bit better deeper down into the soil, so the seeds will benefit from that as well.
There's also some things maybe in just the home landscape we might want to start thinking about, too. Dividing iris, one of those?
Right. We have been in that time of year for a couple weeks now where it's time to think about dividing the irises. This is particularly important if you noticed your clumps of irises didn't bloom real well this last year. If you had a great bloom and you don't think they look like they're overcrowded, and, well, quite honestly, if you don't have time to divide them, then you could probably postpone it another couple years. It's not something we have to do every year. But in my own personal garden, I didn't get a bunch of blooms on my irises, and I noticed that they were starting to grow on top of each other and even growing over the sidewalk. So I did some dividing and thinning out the iris clumps. So hopefully next year I'll have a much better bloom.
I guess kind of along that same line, then the deadheading will also help promote some blooming.
Right. Now, this is something that not all gardeners want to do, and that's a personal choice. If you are focused on getting more blooms from your plants, then deadheading is something that you probably want to keep up with so that the plant will continue to put energy into creating new flowers and extending your bloom season. But some gardeners want to leave seed heads or allow the flower to turn into a seed head so that they can provide food for the wildlife, and that's another great option. And it eliminates the need for deadheading, so you take your pick.
Peonies are also out there, and they do sometimes require some maintenance.
Yeah, just like with the irises, though, peonies really don't have to be divided too often. Every 3 to 5 years, you could probably even go longer than that. But if your plants didn't bloom real well, that may be something you want to consider, is looking at how big your mother plant is and consider dividing it into smaller plants, and it may take a couple years for them to bloom well again, but as they grow and multiply, you'll see an increased bloom production.
One thing we don't want to do is any spring flowering bulbs, no pruning there.
Right, our shrubs that bloom in the spring, avoid pruning those at this time of year, because what's happening right now from August and September is that they are starting to develop the buds that will bloom in the spring. So if you're cutting back those perennials or those shrubs like forsythia, mock orange, cotoneaster, or viburnums, those are all going to be blooming in the spring. So if you cut them back right now, you're essentially cutting off the buds, cutting off the flowers, and you can expect a reduced bloom in the spring.
And if people want more information on this or anything, they can check out your newsletters.
Exactly. You can email hortsupport@ksu.edu, and we can get you subscribed to the newsletter. Also search the Kansas Garden Guide for some really great information on all things gardening.
That's Cynthia Domenghini, a K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist, on what to do in the garden and home landscape from now through early September. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Chevy Lynn Vasky, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.